In this video, I'm going to show you how to work the applied slip stitch ribbing for the Ice Cream Party Cardi. So we're going to start at the wrist, and you're going to make sure you're using your larger hook. For me, that's a 6mm crochet hook. And we're going to join next to the seam. So you can decide whether you want to join before or after the seam, but we want the applied slip stitch ribbing seam to end and begin near the seam that we've already sewn together for the sleeve. So I'm going to go ahead and insert my hook to the left of the seam and start there. So go ahead and pull up a loop, and then you're going to chain 6. And make sure you're not really pulling tightly on the yarn here. We want these chains to be loose. Slip stitch ribbing needs to be worked with a large hook and loosely, otherwise you're going to find it hard to work into your stitches. So once you've chained 6, go ahead and turn, and we're ready to start row 1. So for row 1, we're going to chain 1, and you can see I accidentally pulled my last chain too tight when I did that. So make sure if you did that too to go ahead and redo that last chain and make sure it's nice and loose. So you're going to chain 1, we're going to skip that chain, and we're going to work into the back loop only of the next chain, and we're going to be working a slip stitch in there loosely. So put your hook in, yarn over, pull up a loop, and kind of lift it before you pull it through that second loop so that it makes that slip stitch loose. So kind of pull up when you do that before you pull it through. Pull up and then pull through. And making sure these are worked nice and loose is really going to help you later because we need to work back into those. This very last chain that you work into might be a little large because it's got our tail connected to it, so you can pull on it to tighten it up. So after you slip stitch in the back loop down the rest of the chains, we're going to slip stitch 2 into the wrist edge. So we've already attached to that stitch. We're going to slip stitch into the next stitch, and then the following stitch. So we're always slip stitching 2 into the body of the wrist. Then you're ready to start row 2 of the applied slip stitch ribbing. So after you turn, you're going to skip these back 2 slip stitches that you just did into the wrist. We don't want to work into those. We want to slip stitch in the back loop only of our 6 slip stitches. That's the total length of our wrist ribbing. And they may be kind of tight and difficult to get into if you work them too tightly. So definitely make sure to work these nice and loose. That might look a little funny at first, but as you continue working these rows and you can build up more fabric, you'll really see how it all ties together and makes a really wonderful fabric. And as you work into that last chain, it may be a little tight. That's the chain next to our turning chain. So that tends to be tight at times. So try your best to make that one loose as well as the rest. And then that is the 2 rows that you're going to be completing across the whole circumference of the wrist. So you're going to turn and chain 1 and repeat row 1, which is slip stitch in the back loop of the 6 slip stitch ribbing. Remember to skip that chain that you just made, of course. And then once you've got your 6 slip stitches, then you're going to slip stitch twice into the wrist of the cardigan. So not that stitch because we're in there. We want to go into the next one. And then the following one. And then for row 2, after you turn, you skip those 2 slip stitches and slip stitch in the 6. And those are the 2 repeats that you're going to do all the way around the circumference of the wrist. Once you've made your way all the way around, I will meet you at the end to show you how to seam it up. I'm approaching the end of the wrist circumference here, and I wanted to show you this because it's an area where you kind of have to make a judgment call. I'm at the end of row 1 where I have to slip stitch into the body of the wrist, and there's really only one spot left, and I need to go in there twice. So I'm going to slip stitch into the seam. And then I'm going to slip stitch into the stitch that has the first row in it. Now, depending on the size you're making and how much seam allowance you put into the sleeve when you seamed it, you may be at this point at the end of row 1 or the end of row 2. It really depends on those factors. So you kind of have to make a judgment call. Where I'm at is I am going to work another row 2. So I'm going to skip those 2 slip stitches and slip stitch my way back down. When making this judgment call, you want to make sure your ribbing is not going to be too tight or restrictive, so you can decide whether you want to work another row or 2 before you've considered it done. So I finished row 2 and I'm going to be joining these together. So whether you finish a row 2, ideally you finish row 2. If not, you finished a row 1, you can still use this joining technique. You'll just be joining from the other direction than I am. So to join the beginning and the ending of your ribbing, you're going to slip stitch the back loops of the beginning and end together. So you're going to chain 1, slip stitch in the back loop of the row you just worked and the back loop of the very first row that you worked. And that is your beginning chain, so there's only 1 loop to work through anyways. And you're going to repeat that down across the 6 slip stitches. As you approach near the wrist, it can be a little harder to see, and some of these might be a little tight if you didn't work them loosely enough like I did. And once you've slip stitched all the way down, you can cut your yarn and fasten it off, and then you'll just need to weave in your ends and repeat it for the other sleeve. Once you've got the applied slip stitch ribbing applied to both wrists, it's time to start the bottom ribbing. So we're going to turn the cardigan upside down and we're going to join to the left front panel here. You're going to want to make sure to join in the outermost stitch because the slip stitch ribbing does pull in a little bit. So you want to make sure you join to the outermost area of the stitch. Once you've got your yarn pulled up, you're going to go ahead and chain 6, just like we did for the wrists. And the applied ribbing is exactly the same. So for row 1, you're going to chain 1 and slip stitch all the way down each chain. And then when we get down to the panel, we're going to slip stitch 2 into the bottom panel. And that's actually our beginning chain, so it should be really easy to work into. Then work a row 2, which is skip those 2 slip stitches that went into the panel and slip stitch in the remaining slip stitches in the back loop only. Just remember to keep working these slip stitches loosely. And you're just going to continue repeating those 2 rows all along the bottom of the cardigan. So once you've worked all the way around the bottom of the cardigan, we'll then start the front button band. The front button band is going to run along the inside. So once you've finished the applied slip stitch ribbing to the bottom of the cardigan, this is what it should look like. It's very stretchy, so don't worry if it pulls. That's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to nice and hug up on the hips. Now, the front button band is a little different than the bottom that we've been doing, and mostly where you put your hook. At the bottom, we were working into stitches, but when we work the front button band in the panels, we're going to be working into row ends. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'm still using the larger hook, which for me is the 6mm hook. Make sure you're using your large hook. And you're going to join to the bottom of that right front panel ribbing. So join to that very first slip stitch there. And once you've pulled up a loop, you're going to go ahead and chain 6. And then work a row 1 by chaining 1 and slip stitching in each chain down. Continuing to work loosely, of course. And then you're going to slip stitch into 2 stitches from the ribbing. We're working the same direction that we were when we were working that applied ribbing. So you're going to continue working the applied slip stitch ribbing down this front panel here, and I'm going to meet you at the front panel to show you how to evenly distribute your slip stitching rows. So I've worked the slip stitch ribbing up to the point that I'm ready to start working into the front panel here. And to space the slip stitch ribbing rows evenly in the front panel, you're going to place 3 rows into every 2 half double crochet row ends. This is what 2 half double crochet row ends looks like. And so if you look at what I've already worked, you can see I worked 1 into a slip stitch ribbing and the next slip stitch into the first part of that first half double crochet row. So now I'm ready to slip stitch another time into that first half double crochet row and then once into the next half double crochet row. So that spaces out 3 rows over 2 half double crochet row ends. And this kind of happens naturally with the fabric, you'll see as you go on. So after I go down and back, you'll see I'll be ready to work. I've worked one there, so I'll be ready to work 2 into that row end, and then 1 time in that row end. And you can see there's only 1 loop to work into in the next row end, and then 2 for the next row end, and then 1 for the next row end, and 2 for the next row end. So it kind of happens naturally as long as you focus on slip stitching into each loop that's available on the ends. You should be naturally placing 3 slip stitch ribbing rows for every 2 half double crochet rows. So go ahead and turn, skip those first 2 slip stitches and slip stitch all the way back down and continue working the ribbing. And this is what your ribbing should look like after you've worked for a couple more rows. So you're going to continue your slip stitch ribbing along the front panel here, remembering to space everything out evenly by doing your 2 and 1, 1 and 1, 2 and 1, all the way around until you get to the shoulder. Once you pass the shoulder, you're going to start hitting the back neck stitches, and you're going to just work 1 slip stitch into each of those stitches when you come to them. Once you get around the back neck and to the other front panel, you're going to continue spacing your slip stitch ribbing rows like you did for the other front panel, and then you're going to stop when you get to this straight edge. That straight edge is where we're going to start spacing the buttonholes. So continue working your slip stitch ribbing all the way around to where the front panel starts to get straight, and I will meet you at that point to show you how to space out the buttonholes. So this is what your piece should look like when you've slip stitched all the way around to the flat edge. And you're ready for the next video, which is how to space the buttonholes.